Hello and welcome to Psychosocial Distancing. This is the podcast book reading discussion where we go through chapter to chapter with the open source psychology textbook. I'm one of your hosts, Daniel Chadbourne, and with me is Thomas Brooks.
Hello again.
And with this episode, we have another special guest. Our guest today is Katie Gray.
Hello.
And we ended up talking a bunch last time before allowing our special guests to tell us a little bit about themselves. And so we'll do that first before we get into our topics today.
Well, thank you for inviting me to your podcast. My name is Katie Gray. I am a librarian and archivist. I have been working in the library field for 21 years. I just had my 21st anniversary. My career is old enough to drink now.
Huzzah!
And huzzah! So yeah, for the majority of my career, I was a public librarian and an archivist within a public library. And so it's only within the last 2 years that I have been an academic librarian and archivist. So I bring a lot of my philosophy of librarianship from that public librarian sphere. A little more for the people.
Would you kind of explain what an archivist is? Like, just
sure.
So people have an idea of what that means. Because I know I didn't know what it was until I took a class from an archivist. And I was like, oh, I've been in school for 10 years and I didn't know what this was.
Right on. So an archivist is somebody who preserves and maintains and also makes accessible materials of a historic nature. Or historical materials. And that is not just old stuff. I think in a lot of people's mind, that's me in a tweedy jacket sitting in a little room somewhere with piles of ledgers around me, which it can be that, but that also extends into the digital realm. We need to talk about maintaining our digital records as well. So basically, this is about sort of safeguarding and making accessible the historic record, both the past historic record and what will be the historic record going forward.
Oh, okay. Very cool.
So having Katie on is predominantly out of the idea that we want to get more non-psychological perspectives, but also today we're getting into conformity. And really these...
Which automatically made you think of the library field? I don't know.
well, the conforming systems in which influence us, and in particular influence us in academia. And one of the topics that me and Thomas had come up with for this is to talk a little bit about research and the conforming pressures of the peer review system, publications, and also this kind of... I would say rampant, because it actually is pretty rampant nowadays, pirating and piracy of academic articles from not just major universities and researchers, but in some cases, some of the countries that are downloading these articles are downloading millions upon millions at a time to basically almost create their own databases with what they're able to get their hands on.
So I know you probably try to be unbiased, but we're going to be burning down the publishing industry, right? That's what we're going to be doing this hour.
I'm gonna try to take an unbiased approach, but as I'll say, I went and read through this ethics paper that I wrote as a graduate student, and I definitely tried to take a very unbiased approach. But as I was reading through the paper, and brushing up on this topic again, that I realized that most of the arguments that are at least within the kind of scientific literature and where people are writing about this system, they're either, kind of defending the scientific process, or they're defending, a need to create a ethical set of standards, but no one is defending the publishing system.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to do that, really. I mean, once you start to learn about how the whole process happens, it's kind of hard to come down on the side of the big publishers.
And so that offers this really good insight into the systems that are in place. So be it academic systems, research systems, that can impede, can cause people to conform, because we have to play by the rules of the system. I need to publish in order to have a job. Well, in order to publish, I have to sign the rights of my research and my work over to a publisher. I have to potentially sign up as an editor or reviewer and do the work for free.
I was just about to say, don't forget to put unpaid in there. Unpaid. Reviewer.
We're not getting paid for this work. I mean, in a way, we kind of are with Prestige, but in the same way that if you're familiar with very outspoken artists, computer designers who talk about these companies that approach them and say, we'll give you exposure, but we can't pay you. That's essentially what's happening. And it creates this, this kind of system that you either conform to the system or you don't. And like with these larger conforming, pressures on us, not conforming to the system can come with some consequences.
I had a particularly triggering moment recently with this process. I worked on co-authored a book chapter for a text about reducing curricular gaps or achievement gaps in curriculum and stuff like that. And it took us probably say 2 years to do the drafting, the submitting, the reviewing, the revising, and the editing. And we finally got it done, and it was such a labor of love, and I'm really proud of this chapter. And then we get an email from the publisher, and they're like, the book's on pre-order. And I'm like, great, let's go see if we can pre-order this. Want to guess how much that book is? $155.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I have to order those books, so yes, I know how much those books cost. Yeah.
I was like, I spent all that labor, and you're about to make a free $155.
And much, much worse in the sciences than in fine arts. Because I also have a science undergraduate degree, and so I am the sciences librarian as well at our institution, and so that falls on me, and it is very hard because I only have X amount of money in my budget, and I have to decide where that's going to go, and that's hard when you're talking about 150. Somebody requested a book, and must have been about a year ago, and it was literally $515, I think. And I just, how can I justify that, on such a small budget? And it's hard. I'll do it particularly if it's because I'm the university archivist, if it's a publication from one of our faculty members, because that's something that needs to be in our archives for posterity. But otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just blown away by that. I was like, wait, I wanted to get this book, but I'm not buying this book now.
Yeah.
To have a publication that I can't afford to see.
Yeah, and we have a colleague who recently self-published a book on violence and media effects, where they had put together kind of everything that had been written in the last ever. And they were told $150 for the book, and they said no, and they self-published on Google. You can get it for $10 now. You can even get a print copy for about $30. And so, if Google is offering $30 print copies if we self-publish our stuff. Now, I will say I did make a note, and I do want to preface this, that as I was reading my paper, I laughed at one moment where I said, with the one exception, that we should defend copy editors. Because I will defend every copy editor that works for a publication and that has to graciously go and find those 2 typos that I've missed and that everyone who has read it has missed, and they find it, and they're getting paid to do it, but they're doing selfless work.
Yeah, we need more copy editors in the world in general. Just we really do. Please. I will say too, I think that, I think part of the pressure, and I'm not a publishing faculty member, so Daniel, you can tell me if I'm wrong or not, I think also comes from above, from your administration wanting you to publish in more prestigious journals. And, you know, sometimes the self-published isn't perceived, well, not sometimes, a lot of times the self-published isn't perceived as prestigious as, you know, getting it through Springer, you know, Oxford or whatever. So I think that's part of where that pressure comes from. It's not, you know, sometimes the faculty want it for their own prestige, but sometimes it's that they have that pressure from outside and they can't self-publish because it won't be, especially if you're on a tenure track. That's my perception of it, at least.
Yeah, it's definitely part of that system.
That's kind of what I was wondering when you were talking about publishing through Google, because coming from like a graduate student perspective, like I could publish something on Google, but that's not going to get me a job necessarily.
Yeah, what's the hiring committee going to think?
Right. Like, oh, good, you threw some stuff up online and you got a
isn't that cute? Good for you.
So
good
precious.
For you.
and it does depend on a lot of factors. You know, part of it depends on the people that we train under. So our thesis advisors, our dissertations advisors who say, this is what's worth publishing. I mean, me and Thomas had, Thomas currently and myself formerly had the same dissertation advisor. And you know, there are times where we're like, look, let's just take a shot and shoot for this journal. And be like, it's probably too highbrow a journal for what this article is going to get into. So let's not. And I've tried, and I think I've gotten lucky once or twice in journals that I wasn't necessarily expecting because I gave it a shot. And I've heard of cases like that. And I was like, you know, what's the worst they're going to do? Reject my paper, and then I'll submit it to that lower tier journal that we were going to do anyway. And so but part of it is their perspective, and then we kind of internalize that because that's what we learn is this is what maybe where our writing is good enough for. The university that we go to plays a big role in that. If you're at for you know any student or anyone outside of the know, they have sort of R1, R2, kind of R3 university. So R1 is your top tier research university. That's where you have professors who are maybe teaching one class and they're doing research, and that's it. I am currently not at one of those universities. I teach 4 classes and do research. But it was better than working adjunct and teaching 5 classes and trying to do research as a graduate student. So,
I will say those R1s are really scary and intimidating for undergrads, because I got my undergrad at an R1 and worked in a research lab, and it was like a whole production. Like there were varying hierarchical structures and levels of like what you were allowed to do, what you weren't allowed to do, who you talked to, who you didn't talk to. And it was like spanned across like 6 different floors of one building. And then coming to like, I think TAMUC is an R2, or are we in R3? I don't remember.
We're somewhere in between an R1 and Highlands.
Yeah.
And no offense to Highlands, and I'll talk about that when you're done. But yeah, we're working in Stephen's lab was definitely something that was there was a pressure, but I think a lot of that pressure was also because Stephen wanted us to succeed and find jobs. And
but it's a lot more personable than say your R1 lab.
Oh yeah, definitely. We met, we could have conversations. We could kind of talk off the cuff with one another. It wasn't sort of this like, you've got the scary, you know, you have to publish or you're out of my lab. Stephen just sends you passive aggressive emails.
So do you then find that there's more academic freedom at a smaller place where there's maybe less of that hierarchy and less of that oversight?
I would say yes, because I made friends with a lot of the graduate students at the R1, and they would come in. I remember a new round of grad students that came into the lab, and I had been there a semester, and they started the semester out like, oh, I'm interested in this topic and this topic and this topic and this topic. But by the time December rolled around, they were all doing the same project. And all of their like whole academic career was already mapped out for them. They knew exactly what their dissertation was going to be, and it was a part of whatever larger project that the professor had already started.
So they were conforming.
Yes. And then in Stephen's lab, we would get together and we would talk about our individual ideas, and then he would shoot down about 90% of them.
95, yeah.
Well, I'd say 5% got put on the, if you have nothing else to do, maybe you can do that. And then we had this small list of stuff. But it could literally be anything. He was very open as long as he thought like it was an idea worth doing a study and potentially publishing, he was fine with it. So there was a lot of academic freedom involved. And I can argue that coming to Highlands, I would put Highlands on kind of that, it's a very teaching-oriented university. So research is expected, but it's a small percent. Teaching is about 70+% of what we're supposed to be doing. And so, but it's very open. The faculty are happy if you're doing something because usually the students are involved in it. Or you're doing collaboration work with other faculty members. There's a lot of intercollegiality to kind of the research extent. There's a really wide array. And I mean, despite being a very, I guess, kind of lower on the research is important, we have some amazing researchers at the university. We were talking at our convocation that, Dr. Rivas is, a kind of world-renowned herpetologist who's on National Geographic episodes about anacondas. Like we have a really established faculty of kind of, amazing researchers, but we're not pressured. We kind of get to focus on what we're interested in. And there's definitely not, at least I haven't felt that perspective that there's not. I mean, I get to publish books about fan research, so and they're happy with it. So yeah, it's there's definitely this, there's not that conforming pressure. It's almost I mean, you're still kind of expected to do something. You should be doing something productive in your field, but what that is really going to be dependent on the person or the students you're working with. And you can try new things. You can think, go outside the box. You don't have to have everything set and only do one thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. One of the projects I've been working on recently with student workers, which I got an influx of student workers when we went to telework, and suddenly they couldn't do their other physical work in the library. So I suddenly had sort of a very nice array of student workers to work on putting together bibliographies of all the publications of our faculty to make sure that our university archives have representations of the work that our faculty members are producing and publishing, which also leads me to back to our topic that we were talking about is I now have them doing the next step, which is trying to get copies of those, particularly articles, of trying to see, and of course with the student workers, I'm having them, how many of these can you find in open access publications? How many of them can you find in databases? Just to see how much of those I can actually get actual copies of, because a bibliography is a good start, so I at least know what our faculty has published, but if I could get copies of all of it, that would be even better. So, and the answer to that question is not a lot of them are available in a openly accessible way. And I'm not asking any of my students to step outside of the ethical bounds,
Yeah,
so.
and this kind of gets outside, because I know, let's say I wanted to do a research project, and let's say I wanted to cite someone else at the university. Normally what I could do is I could contact them and say, hey, I'm interested in your research. And if it's for kind of purely academic reasons, there's kind of a free use or fair use aspect of that. Or if I'm going to use it for a class, there's usually no publishing company is going to come down on me for distributing an article for class. But for a library, it's a little different. It is, especially if I want to catalog it. And then put it in our repository's catalog, which is a sort of official record of what we have. I do have, libraries and archives have a little bit of wiggle room under the umbrella of preservation. I can copy things if it is to preserve this item for long-term use or access. But you're starting to push the limits when you start talking about cataloging it and making it readily available. And that's like I said, I've only been in our academic libraries for 2 years, so that's still waters that I am sort of navigating. But if I can start out having them for preservation purposes, we'll see where things go from there, maybe.
So would you kind of define the difference between articles that are under big name publishers versus open access? And kind of how would students recognize the difference between the two? How should we treat those two sources differently?
Well, I mean, the big difference obviously is right in the title, open access. They're those materials that students can get, or anybody can get readily without access to a database. Now, it's kind of hard when we're teaching research skills for our students, because a lot of the work that they do is through our databases, which are subscription databases, which have both those peer-reviewed, paywalled articles, some of them, and then also some of the open access ones. But we also tend to teach them about sites like Google Scholar to try and find more of those open access ResearchNet. And it's becoming, I was about to say it's becoming easier to find open access. I think, every year it gets a little bit better and a little bit better as those gain traction. PLOS One, for example, in biology, I'm seeing a lot more published there. But, science and nature aren't going to go away anytime soon.
Right.
So it is something that we try to address with students, but I think honestly, it's hard because we teach it both, and we have an undergraduate level research course, and then we have an upper division research course. And I think it's especially hard for undergraduates and maybe even graduates in their early years, because they don't even know that the system exists. They don't even understand the research system. I know I certainly didn't. I have a BS in biology, which is the funniest of all degrees, the BS.
I've got a BS psychology degree, so.
Yes. I didn't know. I went through all of that and did research, and did peer-reviewed journal research, and had no idea what that actual publication process is like. So when you talk to them about open access, because they're able to get these through our databases, that they're like, well, isn't it all open access? I'm like, no, it's not. We're paying you're paying for this, actually.
Right. Yeah.
So I think we really have to start educating scholars at a much earlier point in their careers, I think, about how this whole process works. Because I don't know, I think it makes them better researchers. And I think it would make them allies in the struggle, perhaps, for more open access.
Right. Yeah.
Did that answer your question? I kind of went down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think so. And kind of tagging along with the kind of our prestige conversation earlier about like publishing a Google book or an Amazon book versus like Routledge, for example. Is there kind of a differentiation in the way that I guess people can form around or against open access resources?
I think, just like with journals, I think because it's a topic of conversation and so many people have been talking about it, I think there is more and more acceptance and acceptability for independently published materials. The library where I previously worked, I could suggest things. I could not purchase things. But I could suggest them. And our library at the time had a strict policy against self-publishing. They absolutely would not buy self-published materials at all. And I think they were afraid of an influx. Basically, I think they were afraid that once they said, we will buy self-published materials, then everybody would say, buy my book, buy my book, buy my book.
Right.
And then they would just be flooded with those kind of requests. But I think that there is more and more of a shift away from that. I hope that there is. I know I tend to be more open-minded about things like that. I try not to, actually, I might be a little biased in the other way, because every time I see Elsevier as the publisher, I'm like, oh, do I really have to buy this? But it can also be hard from a purchasing standpoint, because, I mean, this is getting into inside baseball stuff, but libraries also have purchasing agreements, and universities in general, purchasing agreements. You can buy from here, you can't buy from there, or you have to have a purchase order to buy it from here or there. So, we buy from particular vendors. And so if it's a small publication that's maybe not available through that vendor, then we don't even have an administrative angle to take to even purchase it. So it can be a little tricky.
Yeah, that kind of ties into some of those systems that are in place.
Yes.
And so, like at Highlands, we have a lot of flexibility in our textbook choices. So, if you would have asked me maybe 6 or 7 years ago when actually it's 10 years now, that I started teaching, how did I feel about open access versus published versus certain publishers? I didn't have much stake in the game because I was told this is going to be our social psychology textbook for the year. Good luck. Write your class around that, and then every couple of years we would have a committee. We would make a decision on what the new textbook was going to be, but there would be a purchasing agreement and some plan, and they'd sell the book to the students. But now I have a lot of freedom with that, and again, with I think open access getting a lot more acceptability, a lot more mainstream. And there's a lot more nuance. A lot of the discussions that we were maybe having 5-10 years ago revolving around predatory journals, pay-to-publish journals, self-publishing journals and whatnot. I think at least within the community, and I mean, part of this maybe is working out to some degree because we don't have a ton of people who know, so that there is this kind of very insular almost organization of professionals who are doing this publishing, who are in the know, who are really readily able to speak out and speak up against fraud, or don't publish there, here's a good journal, or this is a good open access journal versus this seems predatory. And even then, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to agree. I mean, and part of the problem with, the predatory journals is it can be very hard to tell, what is or isn't. And that's another thing that we go into when we're purchasing things. It can be really difficult to figure out if that is a predatory journal or not. And then, how do you then advise students how to use it and whether or not to publish in it?
Yeah, what's kind of the consequence of a library making a connection or a purchase through a predatory journal? Because for personally, either it shows up on your CV and people are like, oh, that's not a good journal to publish in, or you've forked out a bunch of money and then you're, in the can with your journal article. But what's the relationship institution to institution?
I'm not sure on that, honestly, because I've never, I don't know if nobody just wants to admit that they've purchased those predatory journals. I know that the last time I went to a conference and went to a session on the predatory journals, there was a lot of discussion. A lot of people were saying, how do we know when we make our purchasing? And the answer was kind of like, you can kind of try this, because some people were also pointing out that you may think that it's predatory, but maybe it's actually just a niche publication, and without seeing the back end, without seeing how they're following the money and seeing how their finances work, how can you make that judgment, and how are you qualified to make that judgment of whether or not this is predatory, or whether it's maybe just a specialty publication that's giving voice to people who would not normally be able to find their way into one of the prestige journals.
With my limited understanding, because I did spend 2 years working reference back as a grad student, that some of these, like let's say EBSCO is a bundle. And so you pay for EBSCO, and EBSCO says, all right, we've bundled all of these journals together for you. And something might slip through the cracks on that end, but for the most part, you're getting, Wiley, Blackwell, Elsevier, Sage, things like that. These kind of prominent names, and that kind of bundle helps with the cost a little bit, and so you're not really picking journals individually unless there's a request, unless there's like a faculty member who's like, I really need this journal because I use it. And
yeah,
that's,
and
that
yeah,
I think
thank you
can
for
be-
that clarification. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
that is how they're purchased. Yeah.
and it could sometimes be really hard too. I'm a big proponent. That's my part of my morning news routine, as I check my daily update for Retraction Watch. And so Retraction Watch is a kind of an online news site where they talk about broad ethical violations in science. And a lot of the stuff they're talking about aren't necessarily predatory journals. There's stuff that slips through the cracks of legitimate journals. But that's, again, tied to a lot of these conforming pressures where if you're working at that R1 institution, you have this pressure to publish. You have to get X number of articles out at any given time within a year. So for me, if I publish like one article a year, the university is ecstatic. For some of these R1 institutions, you're talking about 4, 5, 6, a dozen that you're expected to be publishing, and in high-tier, high-impact journals, which may lead, and there seems to be some evidence in some of that case, that may lead to people cutting corners or manipulating data. And it's very common in some countries over others, again, because of some of the conforming practices. There's a lot of positive news out of some of the countries where it's a little more likely that their kind of regional boards or national boards are kind of starting to crack down and try to avoid some of this. Yeah, and so that these pressures, these conforming pressures of what we need to do may lead some people to go, look, I mean, it's either I do this or I lose my job. Whatever it takes. I might have to pay to get in a journal. I might have to go and find someone willing to publish this or to kind of skirt some of the ethical rules.
Yeah, I actually thought about that a lot when I was reading this chapter from this book. The whole concept of public compliance, which I think is what a lot of us are doing. I think a lot of us are sort of we're complying on this superficial level, but that's not actually our opinion. But you're kind of having to play the game. That might not be what public compliance is, but that's what really jumped out at me.
That's kind of what, I think you're spot on with that, because there's that kind of, there's the two flip sides to conformity. There's public compliance with private acceptance, and that's where you comply and you believe what you're doing is right. And I think if you're a grad student working in a lab and your professor is saying you have to do this, and you go, well, that's just how the system works. That's what I'm supposed to do. This isn't wrong. Then you're engaging in that type. But once you've experienced aspects of that system, you can get into this public compliance without private acceptance. And that's where you're like, I don't agree with this, but I have no choice. Or I don't agree that this textbook that I'm offering my students should be worth $200. But I don't have a choice to use it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
there's no power. You don't have the power to change the system, and you have to work within it. Power being, I think, another section of the book, not to lead you on.
Yeah.
I think
Tell us about power.
One of the things that I've experienced working at a community college actually was that they do have the required textbook and the required online resources to go along with it. And so one of the things that I've tried to do, like when I work at TAMUC, they don't care what I use. They're like, use a textbook, great. Use an open access source, great. Use a collection of journal articles that you've printed off the web and compile them together for your reading materials, great.
Fair use doctrine. There you go.
And so it's been very challenging to work within the community college system when there's an expectation to, most of these students are very working class. And like they're already buying the $300 intro to biology book. I'm like, guys, I don't feel comfortable making you buy like $200 worth of psych materials if I already have a stack of articles in my right hand. For you to just kind of peruse.
Yes.
I need to mention that's how it was when I was an undergrad, and the worst textbook I ever bought was an Intro to German. So I took that as my foreign language. It was a new edition. It was almost $100, and it was literally a photocopied version of the 4th edition, which was in color and nicer, and it was word for word. They changed absolutely nothing in it. They photocopied it.
And that's kind of the thing that really irritates me is that I can construct a much better class with those 10 journal articles and make sure they're all published in like 2020 rather than some of the crap that I've read in a textbook. I'm like, this is basic. We could talk about so much more than this. Why are you paying for this?
But I think you're right. I think so many students don't know any better. Well, how would they? How would they? Unless their parents were after them, how would they know that that's not the way that it should be done? Unless
right. Yeah, no, because we're modeling that behavior like it's normal already for them.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
We have to, I mean, that again kind of gets into the power and the conformity aspects that you change that knowledge of that by talking about it, by being open about it, by showing other options or showing that it could be done in different ways. And, and some of it gets to a point, I mean, when you're talking about offering your students a bunch of 2020 articles, those articles might be really difficult to come by. And it kind of gets to one of like the big talking points that I had is dealing with the piracy of academic articles. That there's her name's Dr. Alexandra Ilbakin. She's a Russian, I believe, biologist, but she helped to create what's called Sci-Hub.
Sci-Hub. I was like, Russian. Oh, I know what we're talking about.
No. And Elsevier in particular has been fighting to get it shut down. I think they're on right now like their 8th or 9th actual website. They keep changing the domain, the sci-hub dot something. And that part of her argument was she needed this stuff to graduate. And it was either to shell out. I put in my notes, and I'll read you this quote, because this is something, though I will say I went and re-looked up this article. It is now under a different kind of distribution house. And if you're using it for your class, they will give it to you for free. If you're using it for like your own book, you'll pay a fee. If you're putting it like a bound text for your students to like purchase or something, you will pay a small fee, and it's really cheap, all things considered. But everything else, like if you're a grad student, it's free. They don't even question it. They're like, oh, you're using it for a dissertation or a thesis? Here, take it. But at the time, this was 4 years ago, I said, for a paper on the peer review process, let's say this one, I was writing a paper on the peer review process. It may be helpful for me to sample some information from Peter and Cece's 1982 article titled Peer Review Practices of Psychological Journals, The Fate of Published Articles Submitted Again. It's a 30-plus year publication. It's about as old as I am. And it's $45 just to buy a single article. You can rent it. You can rent it for $6 for like 24 hours.
Oh,
and this was 4 years ago. It is better now. I'm really happy that I looked it up and was like, oh, it's kind of fixed. Like there's still a fee in some cases, but those fees are not for those fair use research oriented things. They're more tied to other uses. But even then, it was still like if I wanted to use it for a class of 30, it would have still been like $15 out of my pocket, which again may not even be applicable for me to use. I might be working at a local community college and making the bare minimum as an adjunct and not be able to afford that. And so do you want to just take a guess at what so I had this additional thing, and it's just to see if it's worth even reviewing, because you couldn't read the abstract. There was no abstract for the paper. You don't know what the twist of this whole article, this $45 article is?
I can only imagine.
It's only one page.
Oh, that hurt. Oh, that hurt.
It's a one-page review.
Oh, no.
Oh, my God. Oh, I wish I could be surprised by that. It's interesting, though, what you mentioned there, that problem of finding that paper, which is 30 years old, right? Which you should be fine. And this is something that I have found with databases, because most universities do get their journals through these database packages, right? It's just more convenient. It's more economical. We don't have the time to sit down and like pick all of our journals by hand.
Journals take up a lot of space.
So much space. But the thing about databases is on the front end part of that, a lot of journals have a database embargo. So that even if you have database access to a particular journal, you don't get the most recent 6 months or the most recent 12 months, sometimes even the most recent 18 months if the publisher is really a stickler about it. And on the other end of things, a lot of times you don't get articles that are much older either, because there are specific databases and specific journal packages that are for their archival materials. So the majority of academic libraries are buying these journal packages that don't even have the absolute most recent stuff or the older stuff. American Chemical Society is a perfect example. We have a subscription to their package for our chemistry department, but their archival journal articles is a separate database altogether. So, you have to pay for that in addition if you want to get any of those older articles. So it's all of these, I think, are the reasons that a lot of people pirate, quite frankly, because they figure we're already paying all this money. Because I'm not anti-business. The publishing industry, it's got to make some kind of profit or it ceases to exist. I'm a realist in that fashion.
It can be really helpful to have someone to, again, review. Like, that's part of one of the big arguments for it is that we have a system in place for editorial oversight, review, though there are whole articles on issues with the reviewing system.
Yes, yes.
Who reviews what.
They should all be blind, but,
No.
it's just me.
It's hard to be blind when your suggestions and your review comments are like 8 of your own publications that have been cited in the article you're reviewing.
I've definitely seen that before. Or when it's very directly obvious, like especially if it's a controversial topic that this person is on the other side or learned from the opposing professor, the opposing scholar's side. I know, again, our colleague.
Yeah,
is
we have a problem with that at A&M Commerce with one of our labs. There's 2 camps, and they constantly review each other's own stuff, and so nobody gets published.
Wow, how incestuous.
And then we have another colleague who does media violence research with one of the 2 big names, and one of the big names is kind of for these effects, or at least, hey, there's evidence to show that these effects, like priming, happens. And then the other camp is priming doesn't exist, for lack of a better summary. But those 2 camps, they hate each other. I've seen them show up at conferences just to ask loaded questions. Literally pay $100 to go to a pre-conference to ask one of these guys a loaded question, just to stir up stuff. There were lawsuits between these 2.
Oh my God! I would so love to see like a sort of Jets versus Sharks like song throwdown at the conference.
So there's a set of early papers from, I think, like the 80s or 90s between it's Craig Anderson and Ferguson is the opposing researcher, and Anderson and Bushman published this paper. Ferguson published a follow-up. Anderson and Bushman published a follow-up to his follow-up, basically saying all of your assertions are wrong and you should feel bad.
Oh my God.
And then they've just been going back and forth for 20, 30 years. It's just been but yeah, that again, but if you have one of those people as a reviewer, because you're doing very niche stuff, and these reviewers are the people who are doing research in that field, if they disagree with you, not the merits of your work, but the basic tenet of the argument, or maybe you cite someone and they hate that person. And yeah, it gets to be really difficult. But yeah, having that system though it's kind of better than no system. It's better than open, and that's actually something that we're coping with right now in a lot of pre-publication. That there's a lot of debate going on within the scientific community about whether pre-publications are good or bad, because while there's a lot of benefit to saying, all right, here's my publication, everyone in the community can now read it and critique it, it is reviewed in real time. There's been a lot of pre-publications about COVID, and some of them have been conspiracy theory-esque. Like the hydroxychloroquine research. Some people have, and they're getting retracted really fast. and they're getting shot down really fast because it's really shoddy work, but they're showing up in this pre-publication, and it's kind of muddying the waters of how beneficial this could be.
You know what? The internet never forgets.
No.
It doesn't. So if something like that gets out, it doesn't, matter if you've retracted it. It'll take on a life of its own.
Yeah, and I mean that's part of stuff we've kind of alluded to already in this podcast, is that we have these issues that once it's out there, once you learn about it, it doesn't necessarily go away if there's been a retraction. It's like a news organization saying something offensive, and then a week later going, all right, we're going to retract that thing that we said, and a little offshoot at the end of one of their segments. The same thing happens, that we have these publications that are retracted, but it takes 4 or 5+ years to get them pulled, or a letter attached to them, and at that point they've already been cited. They've already been
right.
Nobody pays attention to retractions. It's
Right.
like, it's like posted it's like posted signs in the library. No one's reading that, no.
I will say you should pay attention to, because it's some of the most interesting stories that you'll read. There's this European, or was it an Australian paper, researcher who published a paper looking specifically at women with endometriosis, and did a spin-off study where he had people rate them on levels of attractiveness, and showed a correlation between attractiveness and diagnosis of endometriosis. And it was one of the most offensive studies most people have read in that field. They're still fighting to remove it. It's
okay, for
disgusting
everybody,
look on your face.
I was going to say, for anybody who's just listening and can't see the look of horror and anger on my face, I have no poker face whatsoever. Yeah, that's
they've been fighting. Yeah, and it's the back and forth, but also like how long it takes to fight someone who has some power in the system, because this person is at least known enough or associated with the journal enough to do it. And there are some other examples. There's a recent story about this one of these big names in research on spiders and like spider socialization. Turns out allegedly, I will say allegedly, I don't want like for some reason that guy to listen to this podcast. We want to like the 10 people who does. And he allegedly had been like false. He had been basically providing the data for a bunch of other. So he's like second author on a ton of research. Allegedly, it may be falsified and fabricated. And there's some lawsuits going down. And again, like there's some really interesting stuff going on in the retraction fields that I'm not a part of. And it's great to look at from a distance. But also to kind of look at and go, man, maybe I should never do that. Like that is wrong.
Yeah.
Why would someone do it? I mean, me and Thomas had talked about a couple of these cases with this guy recently who wrote some really inflammatory stuff about racial and ethnic, makeup and background, and that maybe these people are like that because they're not Western enough. They recently
that kind of sounds like the whole of Victorian science right there, actually.
And he got a retraction. So like that was a recent thing. It played out over like 2 weeks, where it all came out on Twitter. The journal was made aware, and the journal had to back out and say, no, we're just going to retract the paper. This is pretty bad. And apparently got a full review, because that's just the system. He's a big name in the field. He's one of the big names in that kind of social sociology-esque or social sciences type core of the world. And yeah, it's again, like if you've got some level of power, if you're part of that system, or you know how to game the system, or you're asked, hey, so what researchers would you like to have review your paper? Why don't you give us some suggestions? And I go, oh, well, I'm going to put these 3 people down that I know will be positive towards my work as opposed to negative. There's some, but also there's, again, those pressures, the pressure to publish, the pressure for status.
And that kind of goes along with kind of the pressure. Well, that pressure to publish ties into the issue of non-replication as well.
Yes.
because you go
Huge
through
problem.
and you do, oh, here's my new, unique, groundbreaking study. I moved knowledge. Okay, now I can't do a replication study on that because that's no longer new and exciting. So now we have to do something completely different and then break knowledge somewhere else. And then nobody gets incentivized to go back and check the work in the first place.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
could solve our spider socializing problem.
Because it would take someone doing it. And there are cases in, there's a couple of really famous cases in psychology that, especially with like behavioral conditioning, where they ran the study and they found something that kind of went against what was commonly known about basic like classical conditioning, and no journal would publish it. They said, this is all false. Like, you obviously did something wrong. And this was, I mean, this isn't necessarily recent, but this still happens. And it actually took other colleagues of theirs replicating the same study and finding similar results. And then when all of these people suddenly showed up and said, no, it's real, it's happening, we've backed it up, we've replicated it, they finally published the initial work. I think that was, it may have been on like conditioned taste aversion, or you know, some aspects of was it like biological preparedness, conditioning of, you know, there's a bunch of really interesting and potentially scary implications in the conditioning of your like immune system response or suppression of your immune system response through conditioning research. But yeah, that you know, if it doesn't quite fit that system, or you're going against what the big names have said, you have to be kind of a big name yourself. You have to have that power. You have to have some status.
Which means you have to play that game
Right.
all the way out before you can do anything about it.
And at some point we'll talk about the Zimbardo and the social psych replications that were done by a couple of other researchers in the UK. And like, how do you try to debunk Zimbardo? You know, one of the biggest names in social psychology. Well, you have to already kind of have established yourself in the field pretty well. And even then you're not going to, Zimbardo's still going to have a lucrative career.
Oh yeah. He's not, I mean, he's bothered, but he's not bothered.
I wonder how much ego plays into conformity. And specifically what you're talking about is what's making me think of is the inability of some people to say that theory that I held was wrong. You know, some people just don't like saying that. And there's inherently nothing wrong with saying, well, we have new evidence, so that thing that I thought was wrong. But a lot of people have a problem with that, you know, and going against the grain, and admitting they were wrong about something.
Any good scientist, and this is what I try to pass on to my students, any good scientist needs to be humble.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have to be willing to admit that you're wrong. I mean,
the basis of it, right?
The basis of a scientific hypothesis is that it has to be falsifiable. So everything you go into has to have the potential of failing, and you have to be aware of that. But failure breeds knowledge, and if you know anything about cognitive and cognition of learning, and I know Thomas has taken that comprehensive exam, failure leads to learning. That's one of the most basic principles, that we don't really learn. And that might be part of it too, that eventually if you get to a point where you're publishing kind of the same stuff or on the same stuff, and everything you get because you're the big name or you're a big name in the field, and you're not getting rejected, you're getting very few, or maybe in some cases an editor is making a decision just to publish it, so you're not getting some of the feedback, or the feedback can be ignored. You know, at some point, maybe you don't fail. Maybe it's kind of, I think that idea with conforming in like academia, when we talk about, you know, there are some professors who, we actually had a problem at a university that I worked at where we were told by the provost, like, you guys can't penalize anyone for attendance. And we were like, well, why? And they were like, well, there were some people in one department who were basically telling students, you miss 3 days, we fail you. And we don't care, doctor's note or not, you miss 3 days, we fail you. And so like, we just have to like correct it. And again, like at some point I'm like, why? Like at what point in the history of you as a professor did you decide it would be okay to do this? It would be okay to be just so mean and uncaring that you would fail someone for missing like 3 days of hospitalization.
And why is 3 the magic number?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
It's probably arbitrary. It's a power issue, maybe. I'm not sure. I mean, that might be part of it, that it's that need for ego, to maintain ego. I mean, that's kind of a little bit of what we get into with some of these topics, is like cognitive dissonance. It feels bad to be wrong. It's one of the two basic principles of social psychology is that people like to be correct and people like to feel good. And I argue it's all about feeling good, because when you're wrong, you feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
that seems logical.
So you want to explain human
But that
behavior.
still doesn't make you not wrong.
Right.
Right. And so, but we go through great lengths to kind of maintain aspects of our self-esteem. We don't like to take hits to it. And especially if maybe we've built up our self-esteem for so long. I mean, I'd also argue
It starts to get a little existential if you start taking too many hits.
Yeah.
The oral comp I'm working on right now is over terror management theory, which says that our self-esteem, the whole point of our self-esteem and for maintaining it is to keep us from thinking about the fact that we're going to die one day and that the universe has no logical rhythm or meaning to it at all. And so if you keep taking hits, things start getting existential. And so you have to constantly bolster up your self-esteem, whether you're right or not.
And part of conformity, arguably, is just to keep up with that being right. Hey, look, everyone else is doing it. Hey, even if I'm wrong, everyone else is wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or it's not your fault.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it's somebody else's. Which we all do that. We all pass the buck a bit. It's this is the way the system is. This is the orders from on high or whatever.
Well, I was going to say I'll take it to that extreme. I'm just following orders, Commandant.
Right.
But that's where the research on conformity. I mean, that's where Milgram did his famous studies.
I'll take responsibility for someone dying of electric shock. Oh, okay, that's fine.
Right, and again, because in some of those cases they weren't thinking about it, but that's that's potentially part of it, and also it could be a system. I come into a university and my faculty mentor says, "Hey, this is the way you got to do things," or "This is the way things are done around here," or the people around you are acting a certain way, or administration says, and kind of Thomas had prepared some stuff on, especially if you're not tenure track or you're working at a university that doesn't have a union, or
Yep.
At any point they can walk in and go, "You're out, have fun, you got those 2 student complaints, we don't care what they were about, you're gone, see ya."
Yeah, no, that's some of the work done on this was by Ferretti 2011, and he called it the culture of complaint that universities live under right now. And he kind of gave this vague example, like, yeah, no, this is perpetuated by like the news media, but this was like 2011. And so now we actually have like our current president explicitly telling people to complain about their left-wing professors. And so if you get into situations where our students think like consumers and the knowledge and the classes and the credits are the commodity, then it gets very Karen-y, if you will, in the classroom. And so you get students and parents of students, if there's just something wrong, like you start getting taken off for attendance, or you didn't quite get the grade that you wanted, or maybe you got caught for plagiarism.
I call it retail-esque.
Yeah, it gets very retail. And so you can start, submitting to get different grades, and the department heads and the administration are like, we got to keep you as a consumer to keep this place afloat, and so we're going to prioritize you registering in the fall or the next semester over whatever the evaluation the professor gave you.
My office at Southeastern used to be right across from the admin assistant's office.
Oh, jeez.
On one hand, it was the best place because I got along great with the admin assistant, which is rule number 1 in any job is you get in good with the person who is really running the show behind the scenes.
Yep.
And I got in really good. She'd come by and she would just rant about stuff, and I would stop everything I was doing and I would have a conversation with her, and it was great. Because if I ever needed anything, I knew I could count on her, and so she could talk my ear off whenever she wanted to if she needed someone to talk to. But also we had an instance where we busted someone for plagiarism. I busted them about a year and a half prior. A couple of semesters down the line, they take another course, They plagiarize again. They plagiarize the professor's, the course's major professor that he did his dissertation with. And so he knew the paragraph word for word and went, you copied this word for word. When I busted the student for plagiarism, they told me this is how they've always written their papers. Their other teacher was letting them rewrite. And I said, well, I'm not. You're failing the class. Or I think I said they're failing their paper. So they still could pull off a D in the class, but they were failing their paper. I spent hours putting together a packet, basically highlighting everything that they had copied from actual articles. They appealed to the department head. They lost. They appealed to the dean. They lost. They then appealed their grade to me. I told them no. They appealed to the department head again, and they appealed to the dean again. And then like a year later, and this time, they apparently lost it on this professor and went off, like screaming down the hall, and apparently were related to the vice dean of students. And so that professor gets a call from the vice, again, conforming pressures, gets a call, and basically, and the department was pretty, in what I thought was at least a good move, the department was 100% behind the professor. They basically said, no, you're going to figure something out. Like, they're not going to pass this class this semester because this is the rules. This is the university rules. We're not, we're not, this is what the handbook says. Oh, well. But not every university, and that was maybe 2012, 2013. I don't know how that might play out today.
Yeah, no, because especially if you're in a situation where like you're an adjunct or something, like you're not about to go through that because you're replaceable immediately within that system. So one of the things I found when I was going through this paper was that adjuncts are least likely to even pick up plagiarism or think that plagiarism is a problem in the first place. And kind of related to that, if a university hires non-tenure track faculty by like 10%, they see a reduction in graduation rates about around 4 to 5% overall for the university. And so this kind of creates this really bad feedback loop where like professors can't teach because students complain. And then if problems start arising later on and they spiral out of control, like you said earlier, like that, this professor let me write like this. And then you go to another class where you get a professor who's a little bit more stable in their position and won't let that stuff slide. Then you start getting issues with students there. Where,
I definitely wasn't stable in my position when I did that.
But
I had such an overwhelming case against them. I didn't feel that it would be a problem. And it wasn't like now where you've got, and again, I think I could argue that I think there's a conforming pressure for the students too. You need a degree these days. And so you're taking 6 classes. I remember what that's like. It sucks. You're taking 6 upper level classes, 5 upper level classes. You have these big papers to write. They're all due at the same time.
And they're all different styles.
Yeah. I've had to format Chicago before. Not for myself, but
my professional organization uses Chicago. I
had to help tutor that. That was terrible to learn.
But yeah, that like if you're in that system and you go, you know what, like I need to get through this class and I can't stress about it anymore. Like I can at least understand, empathize with what might drive someone to do that. And basic behavioral psychology, if they get away with it, if they have a professor who's lenient, they're more likely to do it again and again and again and again. And so, I mean, there's at least an understanding. Like, it doesn't make it okay. It doesn't make it ethical. It doesn't make it acceptable. But again, it gets to this point that, like, we're all kind of playing into the same system of you have to do this. You have to, make a certain grade. You have to hit certain numbers. Because if you don't, you're not getting into grad school. If you're not hitting at least a 3.0, and you might be lucky if you can do it. I got lucky. I did it with a 3.0. That if you're not able to meet this and again, professor's perspective and a number of other things can influence that.
I think this comes back to what you were saying earlier about not being allowed to fail, or maybe not encouraging failure. And I think part of that is also that not to get too far afield, but our education system is so expensive that, you can't afford to fail classes, and then take more of them for to get your degree. But, maybe by failing, you end up learning more that way, but we don't have that built into our system because it's so expensive to begin with. Students literally can't afford to fail.
Yep.
Yeah.
And grad students can't afford to waste time on, not getting accepted into prestigious journals to not get a job later on too.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's this sort of consistent system, and again, there are people at the forefront. They're writing and they're trying to kind of push back against some of this stuff, and there's a lot of talk about how to possibly change this. But how do you do that if you're part of the system? If you were trained a certain way, or if not, if you were, told like this is how you teach, or we did that the end of last spring. We took this little kind of 2-day course on culturally sensitive syllabi. And one of the big arguments is like, well, why do we have all this stuff in our syllabus? It's a joke to look at. It's so bulky. It's so distant. It's not warm. The students are put off by it. They might not even be willing to kind of reach out to you because the syllabus is scary. Why?
I'm not even going to read it.
Well, half of it you have to put in. I have to put in these big walls of text, and it has to address these certain things. And there are ways around it, but it's difficult because we have to conform. We have to follow these rules to some extent.
Yeah. I think that the only way to kind of buck that system is if you have to be big enough to have a certain amount of power, which of course is addressed in the chapter, like our one institution couldn't do it. We couldn't all say, we're not going to do this anymore. But when you have something like, that's why the University of California system was able to sort of have this showdown with Elsevier that they've been having, is because, it's a huge system. And the UC system produces, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% of all peer-reviewed journals, from their faculty and their researchers. So they have a lot of power there. And so and they're able to say, because it's a university system, they're able to say across their entire system, we're all doing this, and that gives them that power to kind of push back on some of these things. But most of us, in our one institution, or our institution that maybe has 2 or 3 campuses or whatever, we don't have that kind of bargaining power. And so you're just sort of trapped, watching things like UC and hoping that will set a trend that you can then conform to that.
What exactly is UC doing with Elsevier?
Well, they are now back at the negotiation table, but they basically just decided not to re-sign their contract with them, and it had to do with Elsevier wanted to. I pulled something up on it from the UC site actually. That Elsevier wanted to, every year these companies want to change the terms, and there's always a 5 to 6% increase in your costs from the journals. So Elsevier wanted to up the cost. They also wanted to require UC to forgo perpetual access to a number of journals, because that's another thing too. When you have like a database, you don't have perpetual access to those journals in that database. You only have it as long as you pay to access the database. And they wanted to limit UC's financial support for authors. So basically they just had this big break with Elsevier because they have the power to do that. Okay. And like I said, now they're back to the negotiating table. I don't know how that's going to go. The last I heard, they were still trying to negotiate that, but that's the only somebody as big as that system can push back in a concerted effort like that, because I think it takes they have to be unanimous in their that united front with their demands.
I mean, we saw this with the
coalition is key.
Yeah.
Well,
sorry, go ahead,
I
Daniel.
was going to say that California too, like has a lot of, because it's such a big state. It's like what, 6th largest economy in the world.
Huge.
That with the carbon emissions that the current administration tried to roll back, California said, well, we're not doing it. Now all the auto companies are like, we're going to go with California because they buy more cars than anyone else in the US. So we actually need to set our standards to their standard, not to a national standard if it's lower. And yeah, they have power to buck the system. I also want to say, to put this into perspective, these were my 2016 estimates, so it has likely changed. I'm imagining it hasn't changed all that much, but the other things have changed. So estimates in 2016 placed the current market for research publications at a $10 billion a year industry. And this is predominantly being paid for by student tuition. But on top of this, what they also found is that per journal cost is down. The amount of employees that they have working at these companies is down, especially as they're shifting more and more online, which has been going on longer than I think they want to admit. And publishing cost is down. So the cost to actually do everything they're doing is cheaper. The reason that they're not necessarily seeing bigger spikes than 10 billion is because universities, especially like post 2008 recession, university cuts related, but they're still making billions, and it's a billion, and this is like, profit, $1 billion a year industry.
It's almost as if profits are priority over knowledge and learning. What?
But I mean, it all goes back into other things that feed into the system that you've already mentioned, like the peer review system, which is unpaid, right? So they're getting those. You're not getting paid for the reviewing that you're doing for these. It's just for the
I have done that.
Yep.
Same.
So much of the research that goes on, especially at big universities, is taxpayer funded.
Yes.
So we're also paying through the nose for research that we have funded.
They're basically reviewing, or at least facilitating that review, copy editing, which is a cost that needs to be done.
Yes. Agreed. Yes.
We do make mistakes when we write stuff, but it is predominantly the faculty. It's the researchers who are, not just in university settings, but also in like private institutions who are doing research and publishing. It's the researchers. They're writing it. They're doing the research. They're spending years compiling and analyzing data. They're putting it all together. They're editing it. They're reviewing. They're acting as editorial board, reviewing it. They're just kind of putting it together and distributing it. It's that distribution
and advertising it in their other publications.
Which isn't even the same as it used to be, because we're no longer publishing and distributing physical materials. So there's that cost factor that they don't have anymore. But the publishing industry has never really factored that in to the cost to the consumer. They've never factored in the fact that they don't have to actually physically produce materials anymore. This gets off into things about ebooks as well, and ebook licensing. Don't even get me started on the ridiculousness of ebook licensing. But and just as an archivist myself, to know that I'm not actually buying anything. When you purchase an ebook, you are not purchasing anything. You have a license to read it, but you don't actually own it unless you buy a DRM-free book.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of the same thing with like the video game industry is going through the same questions of you're buying a copy, but if you're, whatever it's downloaded on, if your account gets banned or hacked, and you have to, or you want to create a new account, in many cases it's gone. Yeah, you have to rebuy it. You do not have the rights to transfer it. That's why I still have some of my CDs of games that I bought when I was in high school. Just because
I will never get. I have so many boxes of CDs, like music CDs, under my bed. I will never get rid of them. Never.
Definitely a similar problem with like iTunes and whatnot, basically holding the rights to all the music. They could just decide one day, all that music you purchased, you don't own anymore. You don't have the rights to listen to it anymore. It's ours now. It's ours again. And we're taking it all back.
Yep. And not only that, but you have to use our proprietary software to listen to that iTunes music.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, creates that power and conforming structure of what we do and what we have to do.
I haven't even gotten into how much they actually charge libraries for journals and ebooks and things like that versus an individual publication. The exact same publication, but an ebook that a library purchases is going to be exponentially more than the one that you purchase. And the same with journals. And then the funny thing is, I have had to explain this to professors before, because they're like, well, I get this professional journal and it only costs me $100 a year. Why don't you get it? Well, because the library's cost to get that same journal for a year is $2,000 or $3,000.
Mm-hmm.
So I could not believe the number of professors that don't know that.
Yeah, because with my membership to the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, which is it's actually not that bad for an early career. I think it's like $50 a year, $100 a year. It's a little more when you factor in the cost of the conference and everything. But with that, I can opt for the physical, and I get the physical. I get JPS, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and their bulletin. I get both of those for basically with my membership cost. It's part of what my membership cost pays, and it's darn cheap. And if I was a student, it'd be even cheaper than that. I have this whole wall of that journal, but I would imagine it would cost thousands of dollars for the library to acquire it.
Especially in the sciences. I mean, some of the chemistry journals can be like $5,000, $6,000 a year per title, and there's usually a 5 to 6% increase from one year to the next for your subscriptions. It's just ridiculous. I actually looked up my own professional organization, the Society of American Archivists. I pay about $150 a year, and I get our professional journal. And I looked it up for an institution, it's $350. And I actually thought to myself, wow, that's really cheap.
Right?
That's over twice. That's over twice what I pay. But that's super cheap for an institutional subscription. So it's just an inherently insane system, designed to generate just like
and again, kind of
Scrooge McDuck levels of money,
right?
to go back to, I think one of the things that we talked about with certain like library use, that there might be even issues that if I decided like, all right, I'm retiring, I'm going to donate all of my JPSP journals to the library. There might still be issues the library even being able to use those, or would they be? I mean, it would be an iffy gray area.
It's an iffy gray area. Most donations are usually acceptable, mainly because nobody ever finds out about them. But,
And I think getting back to some of this like academic piracy is the average academic research, because they've done some IP tracking, and a lot of the tracking is coming from universities. It's not coming from the average person because the average person at their house, one, may not know that these journals exist and may never need these journals. It's the
or how to find them if they do know they exist.
It's the individuals who are, maybe need them the most. Students, graduate students, faculty members, researchers. That and then there are some countries that are far more that are using this site far more than others, and a lot of those are also countries where it might be a lot more difficult. So you're looking at like Iran and maybe some areas of Russia, and where there's either no money to spend on the same costs, or they're actively saying like, we're not going, you can't have this journal because of some reason. And so, well, I need to do research on it because that's my field. I'm working in a university, and the university will not pay for it for some reason or another. How do I get my hands on it? And they're downloading hundreds of thousands of articles pretty consistently. But for the average person who's downloading one or two, it's kind of like that same donation thing. It's Elsevier's not going after them. They're going to go after the person who's downloading hard drives of articles,
or putting entire books online.
Yes.
Looking at you, Internet Archive, which we were talking about earlier.
Yeah,
Off camera.
No, but that's another. I mean, and again, like you're looking at this group that on one hand is performing the service, trying to maintain things that are open source materials, or at least holding materials until they become. I mean, you also have very similar archives that are doing this with like really old DOS games, where you can go to their website and play all these old games, like these like beginning of computer gaming, because there's no one else, you know, that's able to do this. It's also the same with I follow a couple of people who do work with like Nintendo, like old NES, SNES collecting. Yeah. And there are some of these games that are like prototypes. There's one cartridge. And so someone gets their hands on the cartridge and they rip the data off of it so that, or they copy the data off of it. So we have a permanent record. So if that cartridge were destroyed, that it's there, that you can go and play the, you know, prototype for SimCity for the Nintendo Entertainment System. You know, and then there's I think an argument with that, but you know, the Internet Archive is kind of taking, I guess, that power that they've gotten, and they're starting to kind of skirt the line between what they're sharing. One of the big things that they've done recently is they started this kind of pandemic library where they allowed people to digitally check out. So they would buy books physically, scan them into the system, and then say, you can check this book out, and we will allow you to check out the books. And they lifted the restrictions a little bit because all these libraries were closed, and said, we're going to lift the restriction on the one book per one checkout, which started really getting into some copyright ethical issues. And I think there's even some ethical issues concerning, can you scan and check out, if you have a physical copy of it, but could you check it out digitally if you own that physical copy, if it was donated to you? There's not an answer. I mean, the library wouldn't be able to do that.
No. We don't do that.
No.
And I do feel, you know, this is one of those things where, you know, I have a lot of issues with the big publishing companies, and especially the way that they just milk the research community and make a bajillion dollars on it, and they scam everybody. But there are also actual content creators that need to get paid. You know, authors deserve to get paid for the books that they publish, and it's not their fault if the publisher is Macmillan or one of those, you know.
Yeah, and there's definitely a difference.
Getting even more money off of it. But you know, you don't want to screw over content creators, especially contemporary content creators. You know, some people have issues with the fact that our copyright law protects materials for such a long period of time, even after the death of the author, but especially while an author is still alive and it is a contemporary creation, you know, you deserve to get paid for the work that you've done.
Yeah, and then there's definitely a difference between, let's say, me publishing something and having to sign off my rights to the publisher. I don't get paid for anything that I mean, the book that I published that I published with colleagues is a little different. I can get something from that if people buy it, but it's an academic book, so there's few and far between. But for a research article, I wouldn't get anything. But that would be very different than something like, you know, if I publish a novel.
Yeah. And it's interesting because fair use does take that into consideration, the fair use doctrine, which gives libraries and educational institutions a little bit of wiggle room in sharing content. That's one of the four factors that they talk about, is the nature of the contents. Usually factual content there's a little more room to share factual content as opposed to creative content. Something like somebody's novel. You can't just copy somebody's brand new novel that they've published, you know, but you do have a little more room for sharing factual information, research information. So, and I think that's fair, you know, to sort of protect those content creators. I have a lot of artists and photographers and stuff in my life, so I think about how easily it is for those creative people to get I'm trying not to cuss too much to get, to get taken advantage of and not, not get paid for the work that they do. Yeah.
Right.
Particularly photographers. People tend to think, oh, I've seen it online. I can publish it in my book. I can grab it off the internet
just copy and paste.
Yeah, copy and paste. Sure, absolutely.
Which is an upside to working with a publisher. I mean, that's something that they'll tell you up front. Like we need to look at everything you're putting in this book before it goes out, because we're not playing around. Like, yeah, we're taking some of the money, but we're taking some of the money to make sure that this is a polished product to put out. Yeah,
I've been on the other side of that and had to fill out those forms from publishers. Like, yes, you have permission to use this photograph from our archive. And I mean, their publishers are not gonna.
Right.
Well,
I mean, they don't want
depending
the lawsuit.
on the depending. Some of them are a little sketchier than others. But yeah.
Yeah, I'll use this to plug. This will be like the YouTuber of the podcast is Leonard French. He's a copyright attorney, and I'll have a link to something he did on the case against the Internet Archive. But he also does a bunch. If you want to learn more about fair use and what you can and cannot use, and all of these, he's also done some really crazy stories with things like sovereign citizens, which, if you want to talk about bucking conformity, people who do not recognize the Constitution of the United States because they follow the Magna Carta.
Ooh.
They usually cite the Magna Carta comes up a lot with sovereign citizens. But these really famous cases, he's got a great one on this dissent that a judge wrote where he quotes Star Trek a bunch in it. It's just really good.
I love nerds. I love nerds.
Really good legal stuff. Yeah.
We're everywhere.
But I mean, it definitely gets into, people who are trying to get around the system, people who are following, like, or getting around the system legally. So there are ways to do it. And if you want to create your own work, if I wanted to put some old music, with this podcast, or if I wanted to comment on a video and show a little clip of that, I could, and I know how I can do it. I can work within the system, even though
to make it transformative so that it's no longer.
And even then, we can get into like power and that's a whole another episode. Power and conformity with YouTube, and there's people who've done better videos on that with the copyright systems and stuff like that. But it's
copyright is just a many tentacled.
Yes.
It's I mean, there's a reason there are lawyers that do nothing but copyright, because it's a mess. The American copyright code is a mess. And then when you start getting into American versus European, it's ridiculous. Yeah. But there are ways to share the information without outright piracy. We try to do it in a more ethical way.
And there are, we have things like interlibrary loan, which is a great system.
Shout out to interlibrary loan. Yes.
Got me through grad school both times. But even then, like, there can be issues with what they can obtain and acquire because of copyright issues. And
Yep. Who has it and who's willing to lend it?
Right.
And are they going to charge you for it? Because some interlibrary loan, some libraries will charge you for interlibrary loan as well. So you're still paying for the access. We don't for students and faculty. We
luckily, every university I've been at has not. But yeah, that there are ways to do it. But in some cases it can be difficult, and and there are ways to do it within the bounds. Like, I could still not have to charge for one of my classes because I can use articles that I can obtain legally without piracy. And there are, the ability to share that and do it within the fair use, to share it with my class, or to distribute it just in terms of like giving it to a grad student. Hey, you should read this article for this paper. Without having to worry too much about it.
Cool. Well, do we have a bias of the week, Daniel?
We do. And I picked this one in particular because I thought it was an opposite. So the way that publishing in academia works is actually the opposite of this effect. So I call it the opposite of signing over an article to a publisher. It is the endowment effect. It's Thaler, 1980. It is the tendency for people to demand much more, to give up an object that they would be willing to pay to acquire. Then they would be willing to pay to acquire it.
Oh,
so
okay.
Yeah, so this object that you have that maybe even you were given, that's only worth $20. if you were asked to give it up, you would ask 40 for it. So we tend to have a tendency to be more sentimental to things that we own, even if it is not worth what we would have to pay for it regularly. And I talked about a little bit about things like NES collecting. Video game collecting is a prime example of that.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who go, oh, look, I have, and I'm actually looking at some of the games that I have in my collection. Super Mario World for the SNES. That's like $50, right? It's Mario. Like, no, it's such a common game, 10, 15 bucks at best. And that's high end. I think I've got a couple of games that are maybe worth like 30 just because they're rarer. But most common games, they aren't worth. I mean, most Nintendo games, everyone's got a stack. You know, any collector's got a stack of like Super Mario Duck Hunt for the Nintendo, and those are like $2-3 a piece.
So your heart wants to charge 40.
Realistically, right? But there are people who will find them and say like, "Oh, I've got this, like $40. Like that's how much it's worth." But we kind of add more value to the things that we own that we might be asked to give away than we would actually purchase for it. So it's kind of a bias in the way. Yeah.
As somebody who has had many rare books tried to be thrust upon me, yes, that's people in rare books do that all the time. They want to sell, their grant. So family Bibles, this is a big one. So, people always think, I have this family Bible from the 1800s, it must be worth a lot of money. No. No, I mean, Bibles, if you had any amount of money in a family, the only book you would buy is a Bible. So like, Bibles are one of the most prolific, rare books.
Literally the most sold book in the world.
Exactly. People don't like to be told that, though. But also, this is my great grandmother's diary, and I want to sell it to your archive. People think those are worth a lot more.
Just go on eBay. Like, if you really want to see this in effect.
Yeah, right. Just have a look.
Look at what scalpers are trying to pass off, or in times of non-pandemic, go on eBay and look at what people are trying to sell. Really basic stuff that shouldn't be how much it is.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Those Star Wars bands that I really want another pair of. Oh God, so expensive.
But again, like how much you're willing to pay.
I guess so. Not that much, apparently.
Than how much someone's willing to sell it. But also, I mean, we think about this too. There's a sentimentality to stuff that we own.
We kind of imbue things with symbolism once we own them, and so there's also kind of get that emotional connection there.
There's also some conformity to having to make stupid purchases. And, we have to rationalize, like, no, it's totally worth more than all the money I spent on it. I'm also looking at some of the stuff that I've got in my collection. But I might try to
Toys are always worth it. Just accept that. They're always worth it.
So I mean, I think this has been a really good conversation. I think we're pushing our general hour 30-minute mark. Katie, it was a pleasure to have you.
This is so much fun. Thank you
so much.
Conversation. And so with that, next time I think we're actually going to do a little more on conformity with things like protesting and minority influence. So how do you buck the system if you're in a minority group or if you're in a group with less power and things like that? It's kind of a big chapter for a lot of really interesting talking points and possibilities. So we'll continue that with the next episode. But yeah, until then, goodbye. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Night.